providing. So this should be of concern to us. The second item is they want to leverage states' collective influence to ensure that textbooks, digital media, curricula, assessments are aligned to these international benchmark standards and draw on lessons from high-performing nations and states. Well, that too is an interesting notion for what is the unit of measure again. That's become the nebulous question I was unable to answer. The third item is to revise state policies for recruiting, preparing, developing, and supporting teachers and school leaders to reflect the human capital practices of top-performing nations and states from around the world. The existing state policies that we now enjoy is the question to us as a body. Are these adequate or inadequate? What is functional, what is not functional? Who has done a study in the state of Florida to make an assessment fundamentally of these standards? I haven't seen any. Has any of you? This should be of concern to us. So, when we look at this revisement of state policies, where is that driver going to be coming from? Fourth item is to hold schools and systems accountable through monitoring, interventions, and support to ensure consistently high performance, drawing upon international best practices. What does this sound like, my friends? A form of globalization. That's the plain and simple conclusion here. It's a form of globalization. The fifth item, and finally, is to measure state-level education performance globally by examining student achievement and attainment in an international context to ensure that over time students are receiving the education they need to compete in the 21st century economy. Now, these are certainly interesting from a number of perspectives, so it begs the question, is a standard really the problem? Or is it the implementation of the standard, or the standard itself? Because when we say standards, what are we really arguing? We're arguing a semantical point here. Because what we're really saying is there's a framework. I think Common Core is a framework. Think of it as a framework. You have to have a frame for a structure before you put a facade on it, right? And so the things that you put inside, I think, is what represents the items. And so what we're really trying to do is separate here what is the framework and what is the granular things going in. What is this international standard and who's going to be driving it? So these are the interesting points. Now, to move on, I was going to entertain some questions, but I said no. I'll make this presentation available, however. Is that fair? Okay. There's expected convergences or confluences out of this notion. And so the question begged is, what are these? When we're dealing with a new set of standards, what are the drivers that are going to bring these things together? First of all, Common Core, the various committees that put these standards in place as a framework said that the federal government should be an enabler or an influence to international benchmarking. Well, that on the surface isn't so bad, is it? The question is, what role will the feds play in that? Are they going to want to be a controlling interest, or are they going to be a secondary hand in this process? I have not found any sense of this. Have you all? This is something we should hold our legislatures' feet to the fire with. If we are going to put a framework in place, which is really already put into place, and if you guys don't want it, you better get back with Governor Scott and have him remove it out of our system, because there's going to be a vote coming up on that shortly. However, if this is the standard and this is going to stay in place, you need to, as a body, make sure that you elect legislators who will hold us in the forefront. We must be in the forefront, we must be the drivers. And what you're going to be doing is competing like an Olympic game. Well, you can't compete in the front because you're at the bottom of the heap. That's the kind of politics you're going to be coming up against. The secondary thing is that policymakers, those who are putting these supposed standards in place, have a role now to boost nationalization of research and development investments. It's interesting to note, I'm going to show you what I call the Leaning Tower of Pisa a little bit later, and I'll describe what that is. But the globalization of benchmark best practices is very interesting. Why do we have to globalize our children's education? This has always been, in America, a final benchmark, and I'm going to touch on this later. This is where I separate the two components of the framework and what the driver is politically. And that's the item that I'm going to call the standards. We have expectation. Metrics should be based on what? Grade level. That's basically what the framework defines. All metrics are going to be grade level. They're no longer going to be subject driven. This is what we're used to traditionally, aren't we? Subject driven. The next thing is that there's a globalization of economics are skills driven. So the skill required to do a specific job will become the forefront of the information to put into that empty framework. Now, you have to ask yourself, is that really so bad? Jobs have in general been esteemed a fundamental paradigm shift. So those types of jobs that we see are no longer going to be. They're going to be new job titles. We're going to be job driven in terms of our education. So be prepared for that, whether we like it or whether we don't. This is a shift that's happened. Now they lay out these expectation of skills that students should have at a grade level. I'll never get through this in 10 minutes. Well, let me speed this up to 100 miles an hour. We have detailed expectations of skills mapped to students. We have technological resources, economical and political trends. In the U.S., outsourcing is going to be a dramatical thing that we're going to be doing more and more of. And so when you look at these aspects here, it's no surprise. I'm not surprised for the need to have a framework that's going to be job-oriented rather than subject-oriented. So why did the states adopt this so quickly? Well, part and parcel because of President Obama's administration of the race to the top. You see, there was a big booty at the end of that race. $3.4 billion to be specific. And those states that ratified Common Core will get a share of that. So that was ratified, and as of last September, I don't know what Florida has gotten out of that, but the promise of commonality replacing highly assorted existing state policies was the mumbo-jumbo that we got out of this race to the top. Now here's where I'm going to get into the Leaning Tower of Pisa. There's two components to this: statistics, and we know about statistics, right? Then there's the aspect of what statistics are driven. When we look at math scores, or let's look at the topics: math, science, reading, and problem solving. These are the four essential categories that were statisticalized. The USA scored according to the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Co-op and Development. The US State Department joined up with that group. This is an international consortium. They looked at how many of these countries, out of 30 countries, US scored, where do you think? At the bottom, 25 of 30. Out of 474 points, they were 24 points below average. In science, 21 out of 30, 489, 11 points below average. Reading, 15 of 29, 495, 1 point above average. Problem solving, this disturbs me personally, 24 out of 29, 477, 23 points below average. Now here's what's the kicker here. Comparing to other countries, Finland was at the top of the list in each of these. In this particular statistic I looked at, they looked at this from U.S. to country, countries to U.S., minorities in U.S. to countries. My favorite is the per capita expenditure thing. Now think about this. Finland has an expenditure rate. What do you think the U.S. outspent Finland with? 2 to 1, better than 2 to 1. Now how is this? What is this that we say about insanity? Think about this. So I have to ask the question here, is a framework really a bad thing? I say not. There was another study done, and a couple of professors were interviewed. And I'm going to try to